Okay, today we're going to talk about auditing the purchasing process. Like most of these videos, this was driven by an observation. I watched somebody auditing the process and I thought, well, maybe the sequence could be improved a little bit and I should maybe give some feedback on how to do that. But it's also driven by today's environment. Companies continue to be less vertically integrated. What that means is back 30, 40 years ago, if a company was making particular assembly, they may make all the sub-assemblies and the component parts that goes into it. So they might have a circuit card line and an injection molding line and a stamping line and forming. In today's organizations, those parts that they used to make themselves are now being outsourced. And so from my own experience, I worked at Northrop Grumman, you guys mostly know that, for many years. 70% of the cost of our product was from outsourced suppliers. We didn't make anything. We bought purchased parts and we basically assembled it and we added software to it. So we were what would be called an integrator. And that's become more and more the environment of the day is to be less vertically integrated and more of an integrator. And that makes purchasing more important because if you're going to outsource 70% of your costs, you better have some tight controls on those parts that are coming in. Okay, so what types of suppliers have to be included in the purchasing system? And here's the phrase that you need to hang on to. All suppliers of productive parts and services need to be included under the organization's purchasing process. All suppliers. So that means they can't develop some sort of criteria that says in our purchasing process we're only going to look at the top X suppliers or the top however by dollar. All suppliers of productive materials and services. So that's raw materials, purchased parts, outsourced services related to the QMS, so calibration, for example, or outsourced services related to the product like plating and heat treating. So who doesn't have to be included? Well, it's a pretty small subset. Office supplies, suppliers of machinery, because machinery becomes qualified and then the parts are related to that qualification. Consultants not performing activities in support of the QMS. That means if they're doing internal audits, that's an outsourced services that supports the QMS, so they would need to be on the list. If not, they would not be on the list. And temp agencies, assuming that the final screening is done by the org. I struggled to figure out what to put on this chart because almost everything is included in the QMS. 2019 is the year of sampling. So where do you get your sample? Well, if you're doing purchasing toward the beginning of the audit, which I do not recommend, one way to get real sample is to get it from the plant tour. I don't like that, but sometimes you have no choice if purchasing has to be done very early in the audit. The best place to get it, receiving inspection. You see the parts coming in, you get the part number and supplier names, production, raw materials, feed, inputs to production processes, so it's a good place to get it. You could look at the supplier list if they have a list and identify types of suppliers. It's not the best way of doing it. It's better to get your sample from what you're seeing out on the floor. If you audited calibration, you can see who they outsourced it to if they're doing any outsourcing. These last two bullets are less about where you get your sample and more about how to choose your sample. So of course you want to look at your biggest suppliers and your highest risk suppliers. You can't just look at those suppliers. You need to kind of spread your sample across different suppliers like COTS items, commercial off-the-shelf items, nuts, bolts, washers, but you want to have most of your sample in these biggest suppliers, highest risk suppliers. You also want to make sure your sample includes people who are supplying outsourced special processes like that plating and heat treating. And so I said that on the chart before, and I've said it now again. So that's the hint that we really want you to make sure that you have that in your sample. Let's get into how you audit the process, and it's relatively simple. It's a divide and conquer. In terms of dividing this up, it's how do they get on the list? Once they're on the list, how are they monitored and they reevaluated? If they perform poorly, what happens to them? And then almost as a separate topic, how do we issue POs? What needs to be on them? And you might say, Dave, you can't ask for a list. There's no requirement for a list in the standard, and you're right. But I would say back to you, It's industry terminology. I can ask for anything I want to ask for, but I can't require you to have a list. That is correct. I can't write a finding if you don't have an approved suppliers list, but you have to have some way of tracking the suppliers that you've approved. Okay. So now we're going to hit some of the pitfalls of the clause, and I talked about this first one already. Not all the suppliers on the list. We only do our top 10 by dollar. Is that okay? It is absolutely not okay. They must include all suppliers of productive material and services. The out, they can have different criteria for different types of suppliers. It doesn't have to all be the same, but they all must be included. I was at a supplier doing a stage 1 last year, and I decided to do purchasing because I know this comes up all the time, this top 10 thing. And so they were doing that. And they said, well, our top 15 suppliers supply $30 million of material, and that's the ones we've decided to control. Nowhere in the standard does it allow them to say you only have to control some of your suppliers. It says you have to define the type and extent of control. That does not mean none is allowable. In this case, they had, so I asked them, I said, well, how much money do you spend on suppliers? $61 million. So $31 million, more than half of what they were spending, and they were a big assembly house, was not controlled. So, of course, I told them that that was unacceptable, and they had to include all suppliers of productive material and services. The criteria for evaluation is qualitative, not quantitative. Is it okay? Maybe. So they define the type and extent of control. So once they've included all their suppliers, they decide what criteria to evaluate them against. That criteria should relate to the requirements they're flowing down. So that would be the requirements of the PO. So it is possible that they could have qualitative criteria that would work, but it is also unlikely. And again, down here, I've sort of answered this question. You should look at what they're flowing down on the POs. That's really what they should be evaluating their suppliers against. Those are the requirements they're giving them, and they should evaluate them on their ability to meet requirements. I like to give you guys a sequence. It always starts with what's the process to become a supplier to your organization. That's the equivalent of how do you get on the list. Who's the approval authority? Can you show me some records? Again, the year of sampling. Now, I'm going to pause for a second to talk about records. If you're on a registration, you may see them trying to grandfather in suppliers. And they might try and say something like, all suppliers that were here as of 1/1/2019 are hereby grandfathered. This is unacceptable. Why is it unacceptable? Because there's no term called grandfathering in the standard. They have to qualify their supply base. Now, if they said, all suppliers that were here as of 1/1/19 and have not had an NCMR in the last 6 months are hereby grandfathered. This is acceptable. So now they've given you a date, and they've given you some criteria, and they've performed an evaluation, and you can take that. It's just alternate criteria for qualification. Second point I want to bring up about new suppliers. So let's say you're on a surveillance audit. You don't want to go back and sample new suppliers just to get sample for the sake of sample. You want to make sure your sample makes sense. So if we did purchasing at the registration assessment, and we haven't done it since, and you're on the second continuous assessment or surveillance audit, you have 2 years to ask about, have any suppliers been added in the last 2 years? Don't go back before the registration and start looking at those just to get sample. Just write in your notes if they haven't brought any on in the last 2 years, or if they've only brought on 1 or 2, do the ones they have and write, this is all they've had since the last time purchasing was audited, and you're going to be okay. Once they're on the list, how often are they monitored? Who does it? What are the criteria? Are they different for different types of suppliers? Can you show me the data? Now you're going to get a list. You're going to see quality, on-time delivery. What happens when they're not performing? So you've got a sample of suppliers that you polled, and you're going to check those. Now, they may be all performing perfectly. So what do you do now? Well, you've got the list in front of you. Look for ones that are performing badly. Okay, I see this supplier is performing poorly. Can you show me what you did about it? How often are they reevaluated? Can you show me records? And now we're going to hit risk and opportunity, big part of the new standard. Have they identified any risks related to their supply base? If they have not, you really need to look closely at the process they have for risk and opportunity. In most organizations, as I just have been stressing throughout this, a lot is outsourced, a lot of money is spent on purchased product. Unless their supply base is performing like head and shoulders above everything and they have dual sources for everything, that's the only scenario I can think of where they wouldn't have risk. So, in most organizations, they may be buying parts, the part could go obsolete, especially in electronics. That's a risk to the supply base. Or they could have risk of mergers and acquisitions, or they could have risk driven by tariffs if they're buying stuff from overseas. So you should see, or they could have single sources, and those sources could be maybe going out of business due to, economic conditions. You need to see risks related to the supply base. If you don't see them, like I said, there could be a scenario where that's acceptable, but it's highly unlikely, especially in today's environment where we don't all have dual source suppliers. What information needs to go on a PO? So we're switching tracks here. Who approves them? Can you show me the records? What are they flowing down to the suppliers? Is it drawings? Is it specs? And if they're flowing it down, is it flowed down at a revision level? I want to ask about the goals and objectives related to purchasing. And then I always scan the procedure last just to see if it matches up with what they told me up here. Okay, so some back pocket questions. These three on the right, if you've done IETF or AS, you're probably familiar with them. If a supplier makes a change to a process or changes a material, do you require them to notify? If they change manufacturing location, do you require them to notify? You can't write a finding if they don't in the QM environment. If this was IETF, you could, of course, but you can ask about it to see what the extent of their purchasing controls are. Are they required to do an FAI or PPAP? Who reviews those incoming parts, and how is that communicated to purchasing? So you're looking for an interface. Some clients require ISO certification. So if they do this, what you need to do is say, okay, how do you know they're certified? Maybe they have the certs. Check those certs. Are they current? Is the product they're buying in the scope of that certificate? I guarantee you, if they're requiring this, you're probably either going to have some that are obsolete certs or some where they're buying a product that's not in the scope. It's an easy finding. Do you have requirements for traceability flowed down? How do you do it? I talked about this, and I'm going to stress it again. If they're flowing down drawings or specs, you need to ask them what happens when a revision changes and go through that process. It's super important. This is communication. So if I'm buying part number 123 at revision D, and now I go to E, and that's changing some parameter of the part, of course, because why would I change the rev without it? How does the supplier made aware of that? Are they aware of supplier lead times? Do they factor them into their orders? And then I always look at the PO for the T's and C's. Those are all the contract clauses. I'll scan through them. I don't read them, word for word. And I'll look for things that the organization is requiring. And then I'll ask, say, your T's and C's require this of the supplier. Can you show me that you've gotten this? Usually you'll get the blank stare. How do you document this? You can write whatever you want in Section 3. The only thing the reviewers are looking for is your sample size. So if you just write your sample size, you'll be fine. Bree Bailey wrote this. She did a good job showing her sample. What do your notes look like? My notes are a mess. I like tables. Here's all the suppliers. Here's the commodity. Here's how they got on the list. Here's how they stayed on the list. Here's all the POs. Here's the dates of the POs, the commodity, who approved them, the information that was on them. The point of this is they don't have to be pretty. They just need to show what you sampled. And so in a nutshell, purchasing boils down to how do I get on the list? How often do we evaluate the performance? What happens when they're not performing? And what goes on a PO? And I hope this is helpful to you. The main takeaway I want you to have from this is all suppliers of productive parts and materials and services need to be part of the purchasing system. Thank you.